Welcome to this special event organized with the collaboration of Radio Centre-Ville, Café Lit, a group of young professionals in the Iranian community of Montreal who organize cultural events, lectures, book clubs since 2007. And of course, all the efforts of my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Paknezhad. Thank you so much for helping us to organize this day. My name is Ali Paknezhad. I am pleased to host Professor Charles Taylor on this occasion to launch the Persian edition of the Secular Age, this seminal work in philosophy. Professor Taylor is one of the most prominent philosophers of the 20th and 21st century, has made significant contribution to political philosophy, social theory, and philosophy of language. Some of his notable accomplishments include receiving Kyoto Prize, which is one of the most prestigious awards in the field of philosophy, as well as being laureate of Templeton Prize for his work on intersection of religion and secularism, of course, among many other awards. He has also authored numerous books, including Sources of the Self, which is also translated into Persian and it will be published soon, and also A Secular Age, which are considered seminal works in contemporary philosophy. Professor Taylor, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Oh, thank you.
I would start with my first question, which was covering more or less the same question. And would you please tell us a little bit about the message that you're conveying in the secular age?
Yes. Well, the secular age was the answer to a question, which the question is, what is the secular age? What has happened in the last couple of hundred years in the West? To which there was an earlier answer, which simply was, religion is not believable, so in the light of science, in the light of modern knowledge, so it's gradually declining and disappearing. And this was the majority view of the sociological or social science community for a long time. And towards the end of the 20th century, however, people began to, well, maybe that's not true, because there were various outbreaks of different forms of religious belief, some of them quite frightening, actually, some of the violent ones quite frightening, but others less so. So people began to doubt, even in the sociological community. People said, well, maybe there's something more going on here. So the doubt spread about the standard secularization thesis, but no one had an alternative story. What you needed was an alternative story. And we have a saying in English that fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So I was the fool. I thought there is another story, and I'm going to try to tell it. So the story was really of a deep dissatisfaction. I mean, the story of secularism is a loss of belief. That's obviously true, but it's not the whole story. Because there also is another story, which is the story of people who are seeking, spiritual seekers, who are not necessarily aligned with traditional religions, but often are. And what do I mean by spiritual seeker? I mean that a lot of people who feel that as human beings, they're called to be much better than they in fact are, much more open, much more loving, much more concerned with the welfare of others, much more dedicated to the welfare in general, right, than they are. And they are looking for sources of inspiration which will help them become more of all these things, right? And those are what I call seekers, people who are spiritual seekers. And what I perceived in the world around me was, yes, a loss of religion, many people just leaving, slamming the door, saying it's all nonsense. But I also perceived the existence of more and more younger seekers, very varied, some of them relating to traditional religions in a new way, some of them relating to other religions not Western, like Buddhism and Hinduism or Islam. Some of them looking for it in meditation practice, a whole lot of. And I was trying to channel, if you like, or describe this new culture it's not the whole story either. See, the story of loss of religion is part of it. The story of these seekers is another part. And it's a terribly important part because it makes it, it's a very different history if religion just disappears gradually with a whimper, right? As against the story in which there are people, and this is autobiographical because they include myself. I mean, I wouldn't have been interested in this, or I wouldn't have had the insights I had if I weren't one of those, right? But people that are looking for these other spiritual sources. I use this expression sources in my Sources of the Self, and it's returning in this work. And so what I decided was to try to track that. And track, therefore, a very strong tension in all the existing religious forms, anyway, in the West, in all the denominations, between people who were inspired by these theologies or views, but were seekers, and people, and therefore very critical of traditional practice, and people who were, on the contrary, hanging on to traditional practice, and felt that, everything would go away if you change one small bit of the rules of the whatever it was, whatever the confession was, and therefore were at daggers drawn in a certain sense with the seekers. And my ultimate hope would be to reconcile seekers and the ones who are hanging on, but they'd have to lose the idea that they had to hang on. They had to, they could reinterpret their own more traditional practice as one practice among many. And there's got a lot that is perfectly valid there. But it would be a reconciliation, and we're very far from that, right? And then when I looked, this was all written with the West in mind, but then when you look at the broader scheme of things, it appears that in Buddhist society and Islamic societies, there's something like the same kind of difference of people that are looking for new ways of living. I'm thinking of, I've made a study for the Canadian, Canadian body which is interested in human rights, which the Harper government abolished naturally, but which existed before, in Thailand. And I said the same kind of division. There were people that were concerned Buddhists, they called themselves, and they were looking to a renewal of Thai Buddhism. And then there was over against that the kind of people who are supporting the monarchy and the army. We can see now, if you look at the news, they just had a very bad election. I'm glad they did, the right wing there. But you see that there's and same kind of thing in Sri Lanka. And I think the same kind of thing is visible in the Islamic world. That is. And with the particularity that a lot of the very intense hanging on to the more Salafic understanding is very often accompanied by violence. I mean, there's a lot of a jihadi element involved in that, right? So in a certain sense, you can reconstrue the world in which we live as divided, not simply or not mainly between these different great religious traditions, but it's divided between people who want to live them in a new way and people who don't. And the people who want to live them in a new way, and this is another very important feature, it's very interesting to see that they are much more interested in approaching and understanding and linking with people in other religious traditions, right? So a very important feature of the culture of seekers is their ecumenicism, right? And I'm old enough to have lived the whole gamut of time between the ecumenical movement, which was mainly at that point between Christian denominations, the ecumenical movement as it was at the end of the Second World War, where it mainly was, the idea was we stop attacking each other, stop running each other down, let's respect each other, let's maybe have some common projects. And it has evolved. before my eyes as it were over the decades. And you see now people who have an ecumenicism of friendship, an ecumenicism of exchange, an ecumenicism in which they feel themselves enriched by understanding better what is going on in the life and minds of Buddhists, of Muslims who are also participating in this. So it's a quite a new conception of what it is to live alongside people of other faiths. And again, over against that, you have in many of these faiths people that are not united by their opposition, but on the contrary, are dying to fight each other. So you get in some, Christian denominations in the United States that are very strongly traditionalist. They want to, fight Islam. They want to fight off Islamic danger and so on. And the same goes for Islamic jihadi, right? So there's a very interesting and complex situation in the world in which there are parallel fights going on, but the people on one side of this are interested in learning about their possible allies in the other traditions, and the people who are holding on to the traditions very firmly are eager to fight each other. It makes for a very complex situation.
I remember the last time we talked, you mentioned about the three senses of secularism that you referred to in terms of the separation of state and the institution of religion, and also the decline of practices. And also the last one, I guess, the one that you're explaining, the possibility of multiplicity of approaches to life, whether religious or non-religious, and that's what secularity in the third sense that you were referring to.
Yeah.
And the last time I'm just going to say it in a humorous way, the last time I was having an interview with you, I tried to go through all the details and ask all the key concepts so that somebody would have a good idea about the book. And a friend of mine listened to that and said, "You asked a lot of good questions, but you didn't ask the important question." I said, "What's that?" He said, "You should have asked him, how can we get rid of the mullahs?" So I don't know if you have any kind of insight to that. You can always share that with the audience. But going back to what you were saying about the sources of the self, I remember at a certain time I read the Charles Guinion book on being authentic, which referred to your book. And what I realized when I read your book is that the meaning of definition, the definition of identity, before that, I thought my identity is written in my passport. But after that, I realized that identity, the way you mean it, is the context that allows me to decide what is worthy and what's not worthy.
Yeah.
What is it that I have to stand for?
Yeah.
So in a sense, if I don't have that context to stand for something, I don't have an identity.
Yeah. Well, that's that's interesting because it's a new use of the word identity. I think you can trace it back to maybe 1945, but not before. Before that, in philosophy, the identity question was whether I'm the same person as I was last year, and identity over time. And Locke raises this. But it's interesting to try to understand why the term identity begins to take on this new meaning. And you could give an idea of the new meaning by saying what you just said. My identity is what gives me a context in which I can decide a whole lot of value issues, which is to say that, you could put it in another way, the most basic criteria that I'm using in order to choose in life between going this way and that way, right? But why do people speak of it as an identity? And I think something very important attaches to that shift in vocabulary. I think the shift in vocabulary reflects the idea that identities are not things that are simply given. They're things that you work out. I mean, you have certain sources that you should refer to, but you need to master these sources. You need to understand exactly what they mean, how they impinge on your life. So there's a certain work that you have to do, each individual has to do, to work out what these identity features mean. So I might say being Canadian, being Québécois, being in some sense a Catholic or Christian. Yeah, these are very important to my identity. But when I say this as against what I would have said, more or less in the same direction a century ago, I'm taking account of the fact that we're all modern subjects, so we have to work out a little bit what they mean. Right? And in my case, if I can be autobiographical, it's working out what it meant to be a Christian, to be a Catholic, right? In which I had a strong reaction against what that meant in general in Quebec in my childhood, which was this very strong clerical controlled world, to another kind of understanding in which we are constantly trying to grasp what the gospel is really saying, what it is to say that this figure, Christ, as it were, releases a stream of love in the world that we can somehow connect to and will make us more loving. What do we mean by all that? Well, that's the way you live that as an identity in the modern sense, as against simply as a totally fixed, already fixed code. And I suppose the rebellion was against the notion of Christianity as a very fixed code. And anyone who actually reads the New Testament sees that this is a struggle of the Jesus figure is constantly struggling against people called the Pharisees, maybe unfairly, because he himself is in a way a Pharisee, but who are constantly being criticized because they have a very sort of static and as it were, or dogmatic conception of what it is to follow the law. So you have him confronting Pharisees saying, is it legitimate to heal somebody on the Sabbath, right? In other words, do you have to get the letter of the law or do you have to get the spirit of the law, right? So in a sense, you see, the kind of battle that I saw had to be worked out was anti, as it were, an idea of total codification and anti-clerical, really. It's not the clergy who say we're getting rid of the imams. It's not the clergy that can necessarily help us in this. And it's certainly not a very rigid conception of the law. And I see, similar struggles going on among Muslims that I know that I'm on the same wavelength with. Yeah.
And if you could elaborate, this development of the sense of identity, which, according to your writings, the Latin Christendom had a bearing on the development of this modern sense of identity, and it seems to be going hand in hand in the development of a secular society.
Yeah.
So what are some of the character features of this modern identity which makes possible the emergence of a secular society?
Yeah. Well, it means that the secular society is not simply one which contains a lot of people who have left religion or are against religion. It contains people who have a very active faith life, but who are seeking this kind of redefinition. Right? So it's a tripod rather than simply two views, meeting each other head on. And it's even three is too few, because if you look at a complex society like this one we're living in Canada, there are Muslims who are thinking like this, there are Buddhists who are thinking like this, there are atheists who have come kind of, again, a spiritual sense that they must be much better than they are, and that they have to find sources that can bring them together, to bring them to that. So you get a much more pluralistic understanding of the society. So the same thing goes for secularism as a regime. So you have some people who think of it as a political regime which represses religion and puts it in its place, and other people who think of it as a regime in which the state is not identified with any one stance, whether philosophical or religious or whatever. The state is not the state of Catholics, Anglicans, Muslims, or Buddhists. It's a state for everybody, but very much one in which the state and the law and our ways of operating defend freedom of conscience. And there's a book that I wrote with, which is really the chapter of the commission, on the reasonable accommodation, the chapter that I wrote with Jocelyn Maclure on laïcité in that report, is we published as a separate book. And as we said, laïcité, the two basic principles are the state is neutral and freedom of conscience is an absolutely fundamental right. I mean, the result is that we're in perpetual struggle with, first of all, the Parti québécois, Charte des Valeurs, and with Law 21 that we now have in Quebec. We're not, I announce, we're not going to give up until that law is no longer on the books. It dishonors us. It's something that goes against what ought to be fundamental for us. Anyway, so there are different kinds of laïcité, different kinds of secularism that are fighting with each other. There's a very multi-party battle going on at this point. Yeah.
I know you have had dialogues with your colleagues with respect to the secularity in non-Western societies.
Yes.
And would you elaborate on?
Yeah, well, a lot of our thinking, my thinking has been worked out in relation to India. And I had a colleague, which I've just been in contact with again, Rajiv Barua, who has been very instrumental in articulating the Gandhi-Nehru notion of secularism, which again, once again, was an acceptance of a wide variety of different religious views, but also an attempt to have a conversation between them. And it's tragic for both of us, but particularly for Rajiv, that India has recently gone in an absolutely appalling direction with Modi, just absolutely destroying, utterly destroying. Now, Gandhi for us is a kind of hero. Gandhi for Modi is a traitor. And he actually gave decorations to the people who killed Gandhi. It's something, from our point of view, deeply repugnant. Right? But so you can see that these two kinds of laïcité, these two kinds of secularism are really, in his case, is not a kind of secularism, really. It's a Hindu chauvinism.
Carl Gustav Jung had coined an expression called synchronicity. And I'm going to refer to that because I see some kind of synchronicity for the fact that your book, A Secular Age, was published in Iran in the same year that the most important secularizing movement emerged. Might not be a causal relationship, but I see some kind of synchronicity. So I would like to see, well, how do you see this secularization process in Islamic societies?
Yeah.
And
well, I think it's the same kind of thing. It is some people who, and you have all over the Muslim world, you have people who are thinking this thing through and trying to promote it, that their sense of the spirit of the Muslim religion, the spirit of the Quran, the spirit of requires this kind of openness to the other and requires the development of human qualities of solidarity and respect for the other and a sense of enrichment by talking and exchanging with the other. They see that as the spirit of Islam, and they're over against, once again, people who have a very narrow interpretation and who find their stance, therefore, very dangerous and threatening. But I know people all over the Muslim world who have this same outlook and the same desire. So I don't know who's going to win at any given moment. There won't be perhaps total victory for either of these views, but we, as they say in Italian, la lotta continua, la lutte continue, the struggle goes on.
I know there's not enough time that I could ask all my questions. I do welcome questions if there are. I have received one, but if you have other questions, we could make it as a polylogue. I still have questions to go on, but we are open to the questions. I'm going to ask a couple of more questions about your other works. I mean, I was working on your language animal, and in that book, you referred to two approaches to language. One was what you call it, the inframing instrumental, and the other one being the expressive constitutive, which are one of them looking at the language as a mirror of nature, representing and being used as an instrument, and the other one being language as a creator of certain experience.
Yeah.
What is it? Why is it important to make this distinction?
Well, because there is these set of functions of language that get totally put in the shade. If you think that the important thing about language is that it formulates or frames certain descriptions of the world. Now, so that's certainly one function of language, getting clear on exactly what you see there, try to describe it, and it clarifies it for you. But that's not all that language does. And what I try to show is that language also has creative function. Creative function which actually can change the world that it's describing. I mean, for instance, supposing I have very strong but very confused feelings about someone or some cause and so on, and I'm trying to, that are cause that I either hate or love, and so I'm trying to get it clear, and I arrive at the point where I can clarify it. It's not that I have now described what previously existed, namely my belief or my stance. I have actually clarified and changed that stance when I get clear that this is something really dangerous or this is something really admirable, or so that language has that creative power of changing who I am, what I'm like, and so on. As I move to deeper insight, I change myself. And language, then there's a whole lot of other functions. Language is also that whereby we create our relations with each other. I mean, there's you're an older person like me, a younger person comes along, and you could, and they ask you a question about, what's life about, or what should I do? I could take a stance of, well, I really know, okay, you kid, you're having trouble here, but you listen to me. I create this kind of relationship, right? Or I can say, well, tell me more. I mean, what? In other words, the other way I'm saying we're two human beings who are on the same footing, on the same level. We're trying to work this out, right? And we're always doing that in our conversation. I mean, one or other thing. And so the book actually contains a very interesting passage, I think, on the, I don't know what Farsi is like, but English has lost this, between intimate modes of address and more polite ones. So French has it, tu and vous, right? Or German and Spanish has it, Polish has it, when you move to a third person, right? And like usted or sie into German, right? And well, it's very interesting that you have that these footings are being upset. One of the big changes happening in modern world is people are beginning to rebel against the tu-vous distinction. I tell my students and my children this, and they can't believe it. When I was a kid in Quebec, vous voyez les parents, you would say vous to your parents. What? My children say, are you back in the Middle Ages? They, in their world with their friends, it's completely gone. And it's Swedish, I understand, is completely rebelled against it. So there's you see that this egalitarian rebellion of the 20th century, right, it expresses itself through these various modes of address. That's a way of understanding that we create the footing we stand on with each other through language, not just tu, vous, but also, say, the way I talk down to you. Of course you can't understand this, but let me give, or not. You see, this is, and therefore the message of the book is that a lot of philosophy of language takes for granted that the really important thing is formulating beliefs. And that's not not important. That is important. But it's far from being everything that language does. It's much more powerfully integrated into all of human life.
I also remember in that book you talked about another book was written by John Huizinga, if I pronounce his name correctly. Homo ludens, about the playing animals. In what sense is this a way that to see the relationship of man to religion in terms of the game structure? That in a way we're entering into a kind of structure that helps us to be more than what we are, even though it is within a game system. How can we relate that view of human beings as playing animals and in relation to humans' relationship to religion? Can we see it in the...
Well, because play goes on, I mean, Husgin is right, play goes on being important, because when there are moments when we cease to be completely serious with whatever game we're playing, it can be a game of language, right? So we can have a very, very serious conversation. Or sometimes we can play around with these things. Imagine that we might, and we kind of play with it. Imagine that we're all, on a desert island, or we're all and we play with it, and new possibilities arise. So there's always that relationship and there's always at the same time, l'esprit de sérieux, the people that don't like that are very upset by that think that you're being frivolous and so on. Right? So play, in that sense, retains this very important place in human life.
I'm going to go away from these more philosophical questions upon your books and going to maybe everyday questions. And I would like to know, first of all, what's your reaction towards what's going on in Iran, one of the greatest secularizing movements, we would call it revolutions, women, life, freedom. I'm sure you've been following it.
It's wonderful to see, but I always feel terrible because they're putting their lives on the line, and some of them are being killed. And it's both awe-inspiring and deeply painful to watch, because you know that people are dying, but you understand them, that they really have got to the point where they can't take this any longer, where I mean, there could be people that just want to play the game and don't, but I can understand that they want to have a real authentic stance towards religion, whether it be rejection or acceptance, and this is rendered impossible. And I just don't know what it depends on. I mean, you could think that at this moment it could be a revolutionary moment in which do all the people in the Republican Guard, stand that much with the regime that they can go on shooting their own women? I mean, that's the kind of question that people like me are asking and praying that the regime can be toppled.
I received a question from one of my friends who's here, and I have a lot of sympathy with the question, indeed. And he says, you were involved in a question of hijab, was raised here. I'm not sure if I'm reading it properly. Maybe you can. The way I understood the question is that women of Iran, they're fighting for their freedom.
Yeah.
And the feminist movement in Quebec or in Canada, they are far more concerned with Islamophobia than going and defending these women. Yeah. What should be the reaction to that?
Well, no, but I mean, the feminist movement in Quebec, the majority feminist movement, sees it as I see it, that the issue is one of freedom. And we want freedom for those women in Iran. We want freedom for the Muslim women in Quebec. And therefore not have penalties attending someone who feels they want to express their faith by wearing the hijab. So my feeling is that what we're fighting for in Quebec, the kinds of laicity that we're working for, we're exactly aligned with the people in the streets of Tehran at the moment. We want, even though what we're doing is defending the wearing of it is against defending the not wearing of it, what we believe is that that's something that ought to be a very deep decision taken by the person herself, and not by the state knocking in. And this is the majority feminist view. Now, there are feminists, there are two kinds of people on the other side. One is there are people who are Muslim origin and have been very hurt by experiences, not necessarily in Iran, it could be in Algeria, and they're so angry at that they can't see beyond that anger. And I understand it, but it's not the right policy for us here. And then there are people that are just so much into Quebec laïcité that they can't, having had that terrible experience of a very clericalist regime, people have in their past things that make them very angry, and it sort of angers them if other people put on what they call religious signs, and they aren't thinking beyond their own feelings, right? I had a great fight on the Radio Canada radio with him, who said, I believe in our laïcité in Quebec because my grandmother was forced by the parish priest to have children when she didn't want to have any more children, which is absolutely appalling. But so I said to him, why does that make it better if a woman today, young woman today, who's training to be a teacher and that as a vocation, finds she can't practice her vocation? How does one heal the other? And of course, he didn't have an answer to that. But what he couldn't see, couldn't get beyond, his anger, his sense of grievance. And I understand that, but we have to go beyond that if we're going to live together and really respect each other. I can't make you pay the price for my, parents' errors.
You have written extensively about the process of secularization in the West, and also you have lived and experienced living under the kind of religious despotism.
Yeah.
What a non-Western society, a Muslim society like Iran, can learn from those procedures and your experience?
Yeah. Well, I think the fact that out of this has come not just a sort of mindless rejection of religion, but also new spiritual forms have been given the space to develop, right? And it's that the big lesson. It's not either people go on believing entirely in this authoritarian clerical form, or there is no sense of God, no sense of religion. That's not the choice, and that's not the interesting choice. That's not what the world holds for us. So it's recruiting people to the sense of the value of this third reaction, not denial of religion altogether, not the practice in a very authoritarian way, but a practice of open search for finding new ways of connecting to these very powerful and deep religious traditions.
I remember you said something with regards to modernity, and you were saying that modernity should be protected both from their defenders and those who are attacking it. I think pretty much the same thing can be said about the religion.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And especially in a country like Iran,
Yeah.
and the defenders of Muslim, they're not the best people to promote it.
That's
So
right.
I would also invite if there are any other more questions. We still have another 10 minutes. I know there are people who have worked on your work, and if there are any comments, we still have another 10 minutes. We can continue. To
You saying about atheism in your secularism?
About atheism, yeah.
Atheism,
Yeah.
Is, I haven't heard about it,
Yeah.
and this is my first question.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of atheists, and they're very different from each other. So there is an atheism which is based on a very, to me, very simplistic rejection of any sort of deep questions of meaning that need to be resolved in some way or other that could maybe lead you to belief in God. But there are atheists who have somehow found a spiritual path, if you like, a moral path of their own, and who are therefore can partake in this kind of open ecumenicism that I described earlier. Interested in knowing what I feel, for instance, as I am in their case. And the other context in which this kind of relationship occurs is, of course, any political campaign, right? If you political campaign for, Social Democratic Canada, or a political campaign against the kind of legislation we have in Law 21, gathers together a lot of people from very many different views, and some of them are atheists. But they're interested in defending the right of a Muslim woman to wear the hijab because they think this is something that people ought to have the right to do. So they have that degree of respect for the faith that they're willing to join this. So these are the very different kinds of atheism covers a wide variety of different views.
That is growing in Iran.
Well, I don't, yeah. And of course, the more you have this kind of totally, compulsion, the more you create an atheism of anger, which I quite understand. Yeah, I'm sure it's growing. Yeah.
I think we have another question.
What do you think of postmodernism? I think that this is a very general question. What do you think of?
Yeah, postmodernity. I don't know what that could mean. I mean, I've seen it presented as people who see modernity simply as a very confident belief that we now understand everything and so on. So they want to upset that, and they're right to want to upset that. The various theories that are put forward to upsetting that are not necessarily, to me, my mind, very convincing, right? Because I think of modernity as, again, a kind of search. It's a search for realizing certain values which come after the total domination of societies by one view or another, whether it be the Catholicism of the French monarchy or the atheism of Stalin or Xi or so on, right? When you crack open these kind of total societies, there is a kind of search, and that is central to modernity. So I don't really find a place for postmodernity. I mean, postmodernity would be, we had this pre-modern, we had the modern phase, and now we have something totally different. I just don't see what there could be that would name. Yeah.
I want to continue maybe another last question regarding your latest writing with Professor Craig Calhoun and
Yeah.
Dilip Gonkar, which was on degenerations of democracy.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that? What are those degenerations
Yeah.
of democracy?
Well, I think we wanted to put on the table that democracy is not something which is ever finally achieved. But what you have periods in history when it's making headway and periods in history when it's sliding backwards. And the most important thing to say about that today is that the periods since, let's say, the 1970s in the West have been dominated by neoliberalism and globalization. And these have really led to a worsening of the condition of the majority of less well-off people in these societies, Western societies. And instead of trying to deal with those conditions and help the people concerned, we've had real neoliberalism encourages, and with globalization, that you let the market decide everything. And the result has been that this sense of malaise and of not being treated seriously has been mobilized by the kind of backlash against equality that you see, of course, in Trump in the States, in Marine Le Pen in France, in the ADF in Germany, and so on, right? So the fact that we've allowed the democratic nature of our society to slide in this way has raised an even more dangerous attack on democracy in the name of the people, which would send us even farther backwards, and above all would reproduce the worst kinds of exclusion of minorities that we thought we were overcoming. Right? So that book is an attempt to look at first of all, the democracies can decay, and then secondly, we have in the period of neoliberalism, and thirdly, a lot of things we have to do in order to overcome this. So the book has actually, three parts: what's gone wrong, what's made it even worse, and what we can do to overcome it.
I think there is another 4 or 5 minutes left, and I'm going to ask you my personal question. I'm going to go back to your philosophical writings. I remember I had a course at the Université de Quebec, and one of my teachers, who was one of your students, I think, Marc Jabala, was giving this course on the continental philosophy, and he was saying that if there is one book that you want to read about Hegel, let it be that of Charles Taylor. So I'm going to ask you the question: in 2023, the work that you write on Hegel, how relevant still is today? How important Hegel is today?
I don't think he's all that important, but I think that from another point of view, he's the key to understanding important parts of our history which are still here. My interpretation of Hegel was different from a lot of others because I saw him in the light of the Romantic movement in Germany. I didn't see him purely in the philosophical context. The great philosophers, Spinoza, Kant, Fichte, Hegel. It's an approach which has its importance. But I saw him in relation to the tremendous, boiling up of dissatisfaction in Germany about relating freedom to the emotions, right? No concept of freedom that simply splits humans into reason and emotion, attempt to overcome the reason-emotion split, which was central to the Romantic writers. Right? And so I think that through Hegel, you can understand an important part of our past, which is still very much living. Right? He's not the only way in, so I don't think, if you haven't read Hegel, you won't understand the modern world. But he is one avenue in which you can see the continuing tensions and the continuing sense of dissatisfaction, the need to align reason and emotions that we still haven't quite resolved. And
I still would have plenty of questions to ask, but I don't think there is much time left. Unfortunately, we have to finish it there, but we still have a few minutes for final closing statements if you wanted to add anything.
After all that I've tried to say, I don't know what except that, I see our present predicament, both in terms of democracy and in terms of this situation of belief and unbelief in the world, as two fields in which this tremendous struggles are going on. And I see, just as I see the possibility that democracies could get much worse and even lead to post-democracy, non-democracies, right? Because one of the things you see in the Trump movement and Le Pen movement is attempts to make certain changes irreversible, right? They want to make the exclusion of minorities absolutely irreversible, which would destroy the democracy. So there is this struggle going on which could turn out very badly, and at the same time, this relation to our religious lives and our political lives could also turn. If we have more laws like Law 21, it could turn very badly. So on the contrary, I think that the future is open, but we have massive struggle on our hands. And we just have to go at it as strongly as we can. That's why my philosophical life and my political life have never been very far apart, because I see it in terms of this kind of struggle. And I see, now a lot of my friends think I'm too optimistic, but I don't think so, because I look around at a lot of younger people today, and I find that many of them see a world of diversity, religious and other diversity, as an enrichment. That's something that they find exciting and interesting and really culturally enriching. Right? And therefore, I mean, take the polling that some of us have done about Law 2021 again. There's a majority support for it still in Quebec. But we've shown that if you go down the different age cohorts, the support gets less and less and less. When you get to the 18s and 24s, it's very fragile. So I have a sense that we don't need to lose these battles. We can win, but we have a real struggle on our hands.
Well, I'm going to thank you very much for being generous and giving your time. As usual, it's been very inspirational and enriching. And your book, during the several years I was going through it, has been a source of inspiration for me. So I thank you very much for your presence.
Well, thank you. I really enjoy this discussion. Yeah.